This lesson we're looking at conditions, and conditions allow us to apply some logic within the code. We check to see if a condition is true or false, returning back a Boolean value. And depending on if it's true or false, if it's true, it's going to run the block of code. If it's false, it's going to move on to the next condition. In the next condition, here once again, it's going to check to see if this is true or false. If it's false, we do have a default within using the else, and that's going to be running this block of code within the else. How we can use a ternary operator, where we can run a statement that's going to just return back results depending on the condition. So if the condition is true, it's going to return back the first result. And if it's false, then it's going to return back the value that's on the other side of the colon. There's also a switch statement that we're going to look at in this lesson. Switch statement allows us to have multiple cases as well as a default. So if any of these are matching to the value that we're looking for within the switch statement, then it will run the code that corresponds up until the break. And once it breaks, then it's going to end the case. If none of these cases are matched, it can also use then the default case value and return that back. And that's what we see getting output into the console as we've got different values for checker being passed in. Conditions in JavaScript allow us to apply some logic to the code. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a variable. And this is going to be a variable that's going to increase. So set it up as a starting value of 0. And then adding in a condition. And the first condition is going to check to see if the value of counter is less than 0 or less than 5. And if it is, then we're going to run this block of code that's within the curly brackets. And right now, this will just output within the console, and that's what we get as the output within the console. So this condition is coming back as a Boolean value of true. And what if this condition comes back as false? So that's not going to output anything into the console because this condition is no longer true. So let's go ahead and we're going to make an adjustment. I'll set the value of counter to be 10 and set it so that this condition is no longer true. And this is where we can use else. And else provides us a way to check to see if this is true. And if it's not, then there's something else that we want to do. And this is just going to be outputting this block of code within the else statement. So now the result is going to be that this is no longer true. Within the if statement, you can also add in if-else statements, and they allow you to run another block of code depending on the result if this condition is true or false. So if it's true, it's going to run the block of code, otherwise it's going to move on. So let's set, and we're going to check to see if counter is equal to 10. And then the block of code that we want to run, if this is true, will be that is equal to 10. So now if we change the values of the counter to be 4, what we see is that we get the output of less than 5. And what happened here is that the value of counter being 4, when it comes into the first condition, it checks to see if this is true or false. If this is true, then it runs the block of code. If it's false, it moves on to the next condition where we're checking to see if counter is equal to 10. And if this is also not true, then it will move on to the default, which is the last one where we've just got the else. So there's no conditions. The else will run if both of these are not true. Up as 14, and now we see that if the value of counter is 14, then it's not less than 5. So this does not run. So that's because that statement and condition is not true. The next condition checks to see if counter is equal to 10, and because that's also false, then we just are returning back to the last statement where we're checking to see, and this is just going to be outputting if both of the above conditions are not true. You can also use a switch statement. So a switch statement allows us to check on various cases and check to see if a value and if a condition of a value meets the criteria that we're looking for. So let's add this into a function. And I'll call it checker, and I'll expect a value that gets passed in. And then within the checker, we'll have a switch statement, and the switch statement will check to see on the value of val and checking to see the various cases. So we're checked to see if the value of val is going to be 0. And if it is, then we're going to run this case message variable that will say mess, and then we'll return back the value of mess is going to be first 1. We can have multiple cases. So if the value is going to be equal to 1, and then this is going to return back or value of mess to be last. Also do an indent here so it's a little bit easier to read. A default value, just as we did with the other conditions. If none of those are true, then let's set mess to be none. Within the function, we're going to return back mess. So within the console log, we've got checker, and if the value of checker is 0, it's going to return back none. And the reason why it did that is because it checked all the cases and we didn't add in the breaks for the cases. So the breaks are used to provide a break and to stop the code from executing to the next condition and returning back that value. So once we add in the breaks, that means that this code is going to stop value of mess to first 1, and that's what we're getting returned back within the console. So when we check to see for a value of 10, doesn't match any of the cases within the switch statement. So the result is that mess is going to be equal to none. Whereas if we're using the value of val to be true within the checker, that's going to match this case where mess is going to be equal to last, and that's going to be resulting in the returned value of the mess to be the variable string value of last. A variable called val1. We'll have our condition here, and then using the question mark, if the value of the condition is true, then the value of val will come back as true. And then using the colon, this is going to provide the alternative. So if val, or whatever the condition is, comes back as false, that will be the result. And then within the console, I'll output the value of val1. So we end up getting a value of true, and this is a string value that is returned back. It's not a Boolean value, and it is coming from what we have within the ternary operator. If the condition within the ternary operator is false, then the result will be the second value that's returned back on the other side of the semicolon, and that's where we see that we get the false str being returned back. So let's go ahead and we're going to add in a condition. The condition that we're checking for is going to be the value of counter is greater than 10, and if it is, then we get a value of true. So if you do want to just have a simple string value being assigned, you can use a ternary operator. It's going to provide a more streamlined way in order to make that conditional statement and provide the result depending on whether the condition is true or false.